I wake up Saturday morning, coffee in hand, shuffle to the living room window, and freeze. There's a massive bounce castle, tables everywhere, strangers laughing and setting up chairs, right in my front yard. The smell of someone else's barbecue drifting through my own front window. Not neighbors, not friends, my HOA. No call, no permission, no heads up, nothing. They packed up and left without cleaning a single thing. Ruts in my grass, trash by the creek. And days later, a $50 fine in my mailbox because my garden hose was coiled incorrectly on my own porch. I fought back the right way. Letters, documentation, every rule in the book. They ignored every single one and announced they were coming back. Same yard, bigger event. That's when I made a phone call. 200 bikers, a wedding, done. Same day, same yard. They had no idea what was coming. What would you have done? Drop it in the comments and tell me, what state are you watching from tonight? My name is Garrett Whitfield, and I've been fighting the good fight on a 1.5-acre property in a subdivision outside Clarksburg, West Virginia, since 2009. I bought the land the old-fashioned way, saved every dollar from 15 years of working railroad maintenance, inherited a modest sum from my late father, God rest him, and paid cash for a corner lot that backs up against a creek and a stand of white oak trees older than the state itself. The house is nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a detached workshop where I build furniture on weekends. The smell of sawdust and machine oil is basically my cologne at this point. But the land was mine, and that mattered to me in a way that's hard to explain to people who've never scratched and clawed for something. The subdivision, Ridgemont Estates, was quiet when I moved in. Good people, potluck Fridays in the summer, kids on bikes, the distant bark of dogs. But around 2017, the HOA's makeup started shifting. Long-timers retired, moved away, passed on, and into the vacuum stepped Dolores Fitch. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't believe in throwing words around carelessly. But if you looked up petty authority in the dictionary, Dolores's LinkedIn photo would be right there as the illustration. She was a retired county clerk who had spent 3 decades reminding people about forms, deadlines, and proper channels. And she'd loved every second of it. She wore pastel blazers to HOA meetings. She brought a gavel. She bought a gavel specifically for HOA meetings. She was elected HOA board president in the spring of 2018 with 11 votes. 11. The first thing Dolores did was update the neighborhood's fine structure. Weeds encroaching on the sidewalk edge, $50. Trash bins visible from the street after 6 p.m. on collection day, $25. Unapproved garden ornaments, $75. Her second act was to create the Community Beautification Committee, which, as far as anyone could tell, existed solely to give Dolores an excuse to walk around the neighborhood with a clipboard and a frown. I got my first fine in October 2018, $7 because my mailbox post had a small crack in the paint. I paid it. I touched up the post. I told myself it was just one of those things. Then came January 2019. I'd been out of town for a week visiting my sister in Morgantown. I came back to find a fresh set of tire tracks pressed deep into my front yard's soft January ground. Tracks that curved right up past my oak sapling and looped back out toward the street, inside my fence line, on my property. When I asked around, my neighbor Dale Pruitt told me the HOA had used my corner lot as overflow parking for their annual holiday kickoff social. They'd parked cars across my grass for about 4 hours on a Saturday, left 2 ruts 6 inches deep, and killed a section of zoysia I'd been nursing for 3 summers. No note, no call, no reimbursement offer. I went to the next HOA meeting and raised my hand during open comment. Dolores looked at me over her reading glasses, the way a substitute teacher looks at the kid she's already decided to send to the principal's office. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "that lot sits adjacent to the HOA common easement. We had every right." She did not have every right, not even close, but I didn't know enough yet to prove it. I just sat there in a folding chair that smelled faintly of old coffee and carpet cleaner, and I felt the specific, burning helplessness of a man who knows he's been wronged and can't yet articulate exactly how. That feeling would stay with me for another 18 months, and then it would light a fuse. I am not a lawyer. I want to be upfront about that. I'm a man who reads, who asks questions, and who has a stubborn refusal to let things go when they don't sit right. So after the parking incident, I started doing what I always do when something bothers me. I got into it. I pulled out my original purchase agreement. I requested a copy of the Ridgemont Estates HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC and Rs in the lingo. I requested the HOA's recorded plat map from the county, and I started reading. Here's something most homeowners don't know. Your HOA, CC, and Rs are a contract, both ways. The HOA has to follow its own rules just as much as you do, and if the CC and Rs grant the HOA any kind of easement or access rights over your property, those rights are specifically defined. They don't get to improvise. I found the relevant language in Section 7(4) of Ridgemont's CC and Rs. The association retains a maintenance easement of not more than 4 feet from the outer edge of any HOA designated common area, limited to the purposes of drainage maintenance, utility access, and landscaping of association-owned plantings. That was it. 4 feet. For drainage and utilities, not for parking 40 Honda Civics. I documented the ruts in my yard with photographs. I measured the distance from my fence line to the nearest HOA common area marker, 62 feet. I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board, citing Section 7.4 and requesting acknowledgement that the parking had been unauthorized, plus reimbursement for lawn restoration. I got a quote from a landscaping company, $420. Dolores's written response arrived 11 days later. I still have it framed, honestly. It said, in full, "The board has reviewed your concern and finds no violation of association governing documents. The Ridgemont Estates community spirit depends on all neighbors being willing to contribute to shared events. We trust you understand." Community spirit. I had to put the letter down and go walk around my workshop for 10 minutes before I could see straight. I sent a follow-up letter, this time certified mail, this time with a specific reference to West Virginia Code Section 36B-3-102, which governs HOA authority and the limits of easement rights. I made clear that I was documenting a pattern of unauthorized use, and that if it happened again, I would pursue the matter formally. 2 weeks later, I received a fine notice, $75, unapproved structure, the small wooden bench I'd built and placed at the corner of my yard near the creek path, where old Dale Pruitt sometimes sat in the afternoons and watched the water. I'd had that bench there for 4 years. Suddenly, it was a violation. Now, that is what professionals call a retaliatory fine. And that, it turns out, is actually illegal in West Virginia under HOA regulations. Associations cannot levy fines in direct response to a homeowner exercising their rights or filing a complaint. I didn't know that yet, but I was going to find out. I started keeping a log. Every interaction, every letter, every date and time. The log was a simple notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus. I wrote in it the way my father used to keep his work journals. Facts only, no editorializing. Dates, dollar amounts, names, direct quotes when I had them. What I didn't realize was that I was building a legal record, the same kind of documentation that lawyers charge $300 an hour to compile. The spring HOA social that year came and went without incident on my property. I thought maybe the certified letter had landed. I thought maybe Dolores had looked up that West Virginia statute and quietly decided the corner lot wasn't worth the trouble. I was wrong. She was just waiting for a bigger occasion. The following September, Ridgemont Estates held its first ever Fall Harvest Neighborhood Festival. Dolores announced it at the August meeting, with the energy of a woman unveiling the Sistine Chapel. Bounce castles, a petting zoo. She specifically said petting zoo, like we were a county fairground. A catered barbecue, live acoustic music, and it was to be held on, she smiled when she said it, the green spaces along the creek corridor, including adjacent corner properties. Adjacent corner properties. There was one corner property with creek access in Ridgemont Estates. Mine. I looked around the room. 12 people in folding chairs, most of them staring at their shoes. Dale Pruitt met my eye and gave me the slow, sad blink of a man who knows exactly what just happened. The smell of burnt Folgers and someone's floral perfume hung in the air like a verdict. I raised my hand. Dolores did not call on me. The meeting was adjourned. I drove home that night with the kind of white-hot clarity that only visits you when someone has pushed past the last reasonable boundary. I called a friend named Beaumont Hadley the next morning. Beau is a semi-retired real estate attorney in Charleston, who I've known since we coached Little League together in the early 2000s. I laid out the whole situation over the phone, and Beau was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Garrett, you've actually been building a pretty solid case here without realizing it." He explained two things that changed the game. First, West Virginia Code Section 36B-3-107 specifically states that an HOA cannot use, occupy, or access private property beyond its recorded easement without written consent of the property owner. Violation of this provision can result in the HOA being liable for trespass, including damages and attorney's fees. The key phrase there is attorney's fees, because that's the lever that actually makes HOA boards nervous. It's one thing to face a fine dispute. It's another to face a lawsuit where, if they lose, they personally pay the winning side's legal costs. Second, Beau pointed out something I'd missed in my own CC and RS. Section 12.2, buried near the back. Board members may be held individually liable for decisions made in violation of state law or outside the scope of their authority as defined herein. Individual liability, not just the HOA as an entity, Dolores personally. Legal takeaway. When an HOA acts outside its recorded easement and ignores written objection, it's not just a civil disagreement. It can become a trespass claim with personal liability for board members. Beau drafted me a letter, professional letterhead, cited both statutes, stated clearly that any use of my property for the Fall Harvest Festival without my express written consent would constitute trespass under West Virginia law, and that I was prepared to seek both compensatory and punitive damages, plus attorney's fees. He also noted, politely, that he'd be happy to discuss this with the HOA's legal counsel directly. I hand-delivered a copy to Dolores's door. I also certified mailed a copy to the HOA's registered agent, which I'd looked up through the West Virginia Secretary of State's business registration database. Another free public record most people don't know exists. Dolores's response this time was faster. 3 days, hand-delivered to my door by her teenage nephew, who looked as enthusiastic about this errand as you'd expect. The letter said the board had consulted its own resources and determined that the community festival fell within the scope of HOA community activities, as described in Article 3 of the CC&Rs. It also noted, with what I can only describe as remarkable audacity, that my refusal to participate in community events was being noted, in a letter, from a homeowners association president who bought her own gavel. I called Beau back. He laughed for about 30 seconds straight. Then he told me to keep the letter, and said the phrase noted in that context was meaningless legal chaff, the HOA equivalent of a kid saying, "I know you are, but what am I?" More importantly, Beau pointed out that this letter actually helped us. By asserting in writing that they had the authority to use my property and citing a specific and incorrect CC&R provision, the board was doubling down on a legally indefensible position. In a future legal action, that letter would be evidence of willful disregard of state law, which could strengthen a punitive damages claim. The chessboard was being set. Dolores was playing checkers. Meanwhile, I started making some calls of my own. My cousin Terrence works in event coordination and has contacts throughout the Tri-County area. I called him not because I had a plan yet, but because a thought was forming in the back of my mind. Something about property rights, and the specific power that ownership gives you when you choose to exercise it deliberately. "Let me ask you something theoretical," I said to Terrence. "If a private landowner wanted to rent their property for a large private event, music, guests, maybe some pyrotechnics, what would that involve, legally and logistically?" Terrence went quiet. Then he said, "Garrett, are you about to do what I think you're about to do? Just answer the question." He answered the question. It took 45 minutes and I took 4 pages of notes. The festival was scheduled for the last Saturday of October. I had 7 weeks. I was going to need every one of them. The HOA mailed their festival invitations to the entire neighborhood in early October. Full-color flyers, somebody spent money on those, with an illustrated creek scene and the Ridgemont Estates seal at the top. Community festival, family fun, catered barbecue, live music, Saturday, October 25th. 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. The creek corridor and adjacent green spaces. Adjacent green spaces. Still my yard. Still no call. I put the flyer on my refrigerator with a magnet. I looked at it every morning while I drank my coffee. Some people do vision boards. I had a flyer from a woman who thought she could borrow my land. By this point, I'd done something I probably should have done years earlier. I had a genuine, recorded property survey conducted. I hired Pemberton Land Surveying out of Clarksburg, $280, and had every inch of my 1.5 acres formally staked and documented. The survey confirmed what I already knew. My property line ran exactly where I said it did, and there was no HOA easement extending anywhere near the area Dolores had designated as adjacent green spaces. Zero. Nothing. Not 4 feet. Not 4 inches. The survey gave me something almost as valuable as the legal documentation. It gave me orange survey stakes. Bright orange, 3 feet tall, planted every 8 feet along my entire property boundary. When you drove down the street, you couldn't miss them. They looked like tiny, official, bureaucratic middle fingers. Dolores sent a representative, a nervous man named Craig from the beautification committee, to ask if I'd be relocating the survey markers before the festival. I told Craig that survey markers were legally protected under West Virginia statute, that moving them constituted a misdemeanor, and that I sincerely hoped the board would consult its resources before touching them. Craig retreated to his car and drove away quickly, which gave me a small but genuine joy. 2 weeks before the festival, I filed something with Harrison County. It's called a Declaration of Non-Consent to Easement, and while it's not a universal legal instrument, in West Virginia, it's a useful document. A notarized, recorded statement that you explicitly do not consent to any party using or accessing your property under any claimed easement or right-of-way beyond what's legally recorded. Filing fee? $20. It goes into the public record. It makes any future claim of implied consent nearly impossible. Legal takeaway. A declaration of non-consent to easement, recorded at your county courthouse, is cheap legal armor against HOA overreach. Look up your state's equivalent. Now, here's where the story pivots. About 10 days before the festival, my cousin Terrence called me back. He'd been doing some asking around on the event rental question I'd posed, and he'd found something interesting. A man named Rufus Delacroix. Rufus was the president of the Tri-State Iron Brotherhood, a legitimate motorcycle club based out of Fairmont with chapters throughout the region. Not an outlaw club. These were weekend riders, retired tradesmen, veterans, guys who rode charity runs and raised money for children's hospitals. But they rode Harleys, they were loud, they were proud, and they were looking for a venue for the wedding of one of their longtime members, a man everyone called Thunderclap Ted, who was marrying his longtime partner on the last Saturday of October. Terrence had mentioned my corner lot, the creek backdrop, the open space. Rufus called me himself. Deep voice, unhurried, the kind of man who says what he means the first time and doesn't feel the need to repeat himself. We talked for 20 minutes. He told me what they needed: space for 200 guests, electricity hookups for a sound system, room for bikes to park, and permission for a licensed fireworks show after sundown. They had a professional pyrotechnics company already contracted, all proper permits. I told him my rate for a private property event rental, $1,500, plus they'd be responsible for their own permits, setup, and cleanup. Rufus said that was fair. I told him I had one additional condition. The event had to be scheduled for Saturday, October 25th. There was a pause. Then Rufus said, "That's the date we wanted." I said, "Then we have a deal." I hung up the phone and stood at my kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the orange survey stakes catching the afternoon light along the creek. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. Leaves were coming down off the white oaks in slow, golden spirals. Somewhere about 6 blocks away, Dolores Fitch was probably sharpening her gavel. I went to my workshop and started building a sign. Before I tell you about the sign, I have to tell you what Beau found. About a week after I'd shaken hands, metaphorically, over the phone, with Rufus Delacroix, Beau called me with something unexpected. He'd been doing some due diligence on the HOA as part of our ongoing documentation, and he'd requested their financial records. Now, in West Virginia, homeowners have a statutory right to inspect HOA financial records under Section 36B-3-118. Most people don't know this. Most HOAs are counting on you not knowing this. What Bo found in those records was this. The Ridgemont Estates HOA had not, in fact, maintained adequate insurance coverage on the common areas since 2021. Their policy had lapsed for a period of 7 months due to an administrative error, which might have been innocent. And during that period, 2 maintenance claims had been filed on HOA-owned property. Those claims had been paid out of the HOA's reserve fund, which meant the reserve fund was now at approximately 40% of its required level under their own governing documents. But the bigger problem was this. The HOA's current event liability insurance, the coverage they'd need to host a festival with a petting zoo, catered food, and a bounce castle, had a specific exclusion. It excluded coverage for events held on non-HOA property. Events held on private property, accessed without written consent, would not be covered. If someone got hurt at the Fall Harvest Festival, if a child tripped on one of my survey stakes in the dark, if the petting zoo's goat bit somebody's kid on my side of the property line, Dolores and the board would be personally exposed. Now, I want to be clear. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. That's not what this was about. But Bo explained that this insurance gap was actually the most powerful piece of ammunition I had, because it gave me a legitimate safety argument, not just a property rights argument. I could go to the board, lay this on the table, and watch the color drain out of their faces. Bo also found something else, almost by accident. Back in 2019, when the holiday kickoff social had used my yard for overflow parking, the HOA had billed itself, internally, in their own bookkeeping, for community space rental fee, $200. They had acknowledged in their own records that the space needed to be rented. They just hadn't rented it from me. They'd paid the fee to themselves as a line item, presumably to keep it off the formal ledger. That internal accounting entry was either the sloppiest bookkeeping in HOA history or the most quietly incriminating document I'd ever seen. Bo said, quietly, "They knew it wasn't their property. They just didn't think you'd ever look." I sat with that for a minute. The tick of the clock on my kitchen wall, the faint smell of wood shavings drifting in from the workshop where I'd been sanding all morning. The weight of 5 years of fines and form letters and folding chair frustrations settling into something solid and purposeful. "Okay," I said. "I want to send the board a letter, before the 25th. I want them to know what we found. The insurance gap, the accounting entry, all of it. I want them to have the chance to cancel the festival." Bo understood exactly what I was doing. He said, "You're giving them the exit ramp." "Yes," I said. "Because when they don't take it, there's no defense left." They didn't take it. Dolores sent back a 3-sentence response, calling our claims speculative and our concerns noted. There was that word again. There's a certain kind of focused satisfaction that comes from preparing for something you know is right. Not reckless, not angry, just methodical. Like laying out tools before a job, each one in its place, everything you need within reach and nothing wasted. The 2 weeks before October 25th were the best 2 weeks I'd had in years. First, the permits. My cousin Terrence had walked me through this already, but I want to explain it clearly because it matters. If you want to host a large private event on your land, you need to think in 3 layers: local zoning, county permits, and state-specific requirements. In Harrison County, an outdoor private event with over 100 guests technically requires a special event notification filed with the county office, not a full permit, just a notification with a site plan attached. Cost, $0. I filed it on a Tuesday morning. The county clerk stamped it without blinking. The fireworks were a separate track. Rufus's pyrotechnics company, Mountaineer Pyro, out of Grafton, was already fully licensed at the state level. They just needed the landowner's written authorization, which I provided, and a copy of the county notification, which I attached. Their lead technician, a compact, serious man named Harlan, came out to walk the property on a Wednesday. He wore steel-toed boots, smelled permanently of sulfur, and spoke about fireworks the way a sommelier speaks about wine. Precise, reverent. He laid out a safety perimeter around the launch site at the far end of my property from the creek, staked it with yellow flags, and told me the show would be visible from a 3-mile radius. 3 miles. I asked if that was normal. He looked at me like I'd asked if water was wet. The sound system was Rufus's operation. They had their own rig, a trailer-mounted PA that one of the Brotherhood members used for outdoor concerts. When they rolled it onto my property during the Friday setup, the crunch of gravel under the tires and the low mechanical thud of the trailer hitch releasing sounded, to me, like the opening notes of something long overdue. Now here's the part Bo handled while I handled the physical logistics. The legal documentation trifecta. 3 things went out certified mail, return receipt requested, by October 15th. 1. A formal property use agreement, signed by me and countersigned by Rufus on behalf of the Iron Brotherhood, explicitly authorizing the event on my property on October 25th. This documented my legal use of my own land, established the rental relationship, and created a written record that the activity was intentional and properly arranged. 2. A notice to adjacent property owners. In West Virginia, there's no strict requirement to notify neighbors of a private event, but it's good practice and, frankly, good community relations. I personally walked copies to 12 neighboring houses. I explained what was happening and why. Every single neighbor I spoke to either laughed, nodded slowly, or shook my hand. One woman, a retired nurse named Gloria Hennessy, who lived directly across the creek path, said, "Garrett, I'm bringing potato salad." She brought 2 pounds of potato salad. It was excellent. 3. A final certified letter to the HOA board, copied to their insurance carrier, whose name and contact I'd gotten from the public records Bo had pulled, informing them that a private event would be occurring on my property on October 25th, and that any HOA personnel, equipment, or activities that crossed onto my property during this period would be considered trespass. I attached a copy of my survey, a copy of the county notification, and a copy of the insurance exclusion language from their own policy, which Bo had obtained. I also built the sign. It was 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, made from a sheet of 1/2-inch birch plywood that I'd routed and painted myself. White background, black letters, clean and professional. It read, "Private property event in progress. Authorized use only. Trespass ordinance enforced." I mounted it on 2 cedar posts at the corner of my property facing the street, exactly where the HOA's bounce castle had been set up for the festival they were still planning to hold. On Friday evening, the eve of everything, I walked the property line as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The survey stakes glowed orange in the last light. The sound rig sat quiet under a tarp. Harlan's yellow safety flags snapped in the October wind. The white oaks were full gold and dropping leaves with a dry, papery whisper. Down the street, I could see the HOA's decorating committee beginning to set up their tables on the common area. Streamers, tablecloths weighted with rocks against the breeze. I went inside, made a sandwich, went to bed early. Morning was going to come fast. Saturday, October 25th. Sunrise at 7:48 a.m. I was up at 6, coffee on the porch. The air had that specific cold morning bite of late October in West Virginia, the kind that gets into your collar and reminds you that winter is 3 weeks out and not bluffing. The creek behind the property was running high from Tuesday's rain, and you could hear it from the porch, a constant low murmur, like the land itself clearing its throat. At 8:15, Rufus Delacroix arrived in a black F250, towing nothing but pulling a cloud of authority behind him like it was factory installed. He was a large, unhurried man in his early 60s with a silver beard, a leather vest with 30 years of patches on it, and the particular calm of someone who has dealt with serious problems and knows the difference between serious and merely loud. We shook hands at the gate. He looked at the sign, the stakes, the safety flags. He nodded once. "You ready?" he said. "Been ready," I said. By 9 a.m., the Iron Brotherhood started arriving. Not all at once. They came in groups of 10 and 15. Harleys running 2 by 2 down the residential street with a rumble that vibrated the window glass. The sound of 200 motorcycle engines doesn't build gradually. It arrives. One moment the neighborhood was quiet, and the next, the air itself had a texture to it. Thick, resonant, like standing next to a pipe organ that had been tuned to a lower frequency than God intended. Dolores Fitch, I would later learn from Dale Pruitt, came to her front door at 9:14. She stood there in her bathrobe for several minutes. The HOA festival was supposed to start at 11. I watched from my porch as the Brotherhood set up with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. which they had, many times, at charity events and rallies throughout the region. Bikes parked in neat rows along the far edge of the property. The sound rig came alive, doing a sound check that sent LaGrange by ZZ Top rolling down the creek corridor at a volume normally associated with outdoor stadiums. At 9:45, Craig from the Beautification Committee materialized at my property line. He was wearing an orange HOA volunteer vest and carrying a walkie-talkie, which would have been embarrassing even in less dramatic circumstances. "Mr. Whitfield," Craig said, raising his voice over the sound check. "There seems to be some kind of conflict." "No conflict," I said. "This is a private event, properly permitted on my private property. You're welcome to stand on the sidewalk, Craig. My sign explains the rest." Craig consulted his walkie-talkie, which crackled with an indistinct voice I assumed was Dolores. He looked at the 200 bikers. He looked at my sign. He walked back toward the HOA setup area with the specific posture of a man deeply reconsidering his volunteer commitments. At 10:15, Dolores herself appeared at the edge of the common area. Pastel blazer, orange appropriately, clipboard in hand, reading glasses on. She looked at my property with an expression that moved through surprise, affront, and calculation in about 4 seconds. I waved at her, friendly. She did not wave back. What she did next was call the Harrison County Sheriff's Department. A single cruiser arrived at 10:40. Deputy Roy Stinson, a man I'd met once at a neighbor's 4th of July years back, easygoing, professional, walked the property line, reviewed my county event notification, my survey documentation, and my property deed, all of which I had organized in a manila folder I handed him without being asked. He looked at everything. He looked at my sign. He looked at the 200 motorcycles. He looked with what I can only describe as the expression of a man processing a truly exceptional amount of information at once, down the street at Dolores and Craig and the HOA bounce castle, which had just been inflated approximately 50 yards from my property line. He handed my folder back. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "everything here looks to be in order. This is a legal private event on private property. The notification's filed, the fireworks permit checks out, and the survey establishes your property boundary clearly." He paused. "We did get a noise ordinance complaint." "What time does the ordinance take effect?" I asked. I already knew the answer. Harrison County noise ordinance applied after 10 p.m. on weekends. 10 p.m., he said. "Fireworks are scheduled for 8:30, I said. "Show should be done by 9:15. He nodded. He walked back to his cruiser. As he passed the HOA setup, I could see Dolores intercepting him, clipboard raised. He listened for about 90 seconds, nodded twice with the patient diplomacy of the public servant, and then got in his car and drove away. The band started at 11. Thunderclap Ted and his bride walked out to applause at 11:30, under a canopy of gold oak leaves. Here's the part the HOA didn't anticipate, and honestly, I hadn't either, not entirely. The wedding itself was beautiful. I'm not being sarcastic. I want to be clear about that. Thunderclap Ted, whose actual name, I learned that day, was Theodore Beaumont Raines III, which is a name fit for a governor, was a 61-year-old retired ironworker from Fairmont who had ridden with the Brotherhood for 26 years. His bride, Wanda Louise Kapowski, was a retired school librarian who had met Ted at a charity ride for the Appalachian Children's Hospital in 2019. She arrived on the back of a purple softail with a veil that absolutely should not have worked aerodynamically and somehow looked magnificent. There were 200 people on my property who were, to a one, the most genuinely good-natured crowd I've ever been part of. They picked up every piece of trash they set down. They stayed within the flagged perimeters. They waved at the neighbors walking their dogs on the creek path. Gloria Hennessy arrived at noon with her potato salad and somehow ended up at the reception table next to Wanda's mother. On the other side of the street, the HOA's Fall Harvest Festival was proceeding with the enthusiasm of a required meeting. The bounce castle bobbed in the wind. A man in a white apron presided over a catering setup with the expression of someone who had been told there'd be more people. A quartet of children ran in listless circles around the petting zoo's single, judgmental goat. Dolores spent the first 3 hours of the afternoon on her phone. I don't know who she was calling, but I can tell you the calls weren't making her happier. At 2 p.m., a van pulled up across the street. Local news. Channel 7 out of Clarksburg. a reporter named Shelley Okafor, and a camera operator. They'd been tipped off, and here I should be transparent. The tip came from my neighbor Dale Pruitt, who had worked 30 years in county government and had a nose for a story worth telling. Dale had called the station the day before and described the situation in what he later told me were carefully chosen, legally neutral terms. Shelley Okafor was sharp. She talked to the Brotherhood members. She talked to Wanda and Ted. She talked to Gloria Hennessy, who remains the best possible spokesperson for anything at any time. She looked at my documentation folder, which I provided willingly, and then she walked across the street to the HOA setup and asked Dolores for comment. I was not close enough to hear that conversation, but I could watch Dolores's face. And what I saw was a woman realizing, in real time, that she had been documented, witnessed, outmaneuvered, and was now on camera, in an orange blazer, standing in front of a half-attended community festival, while 200 motorcycles and a fully catered wedding reception operated legally and magnificently 50 yards away. The camera rolled. Dolores spoke. I don't know what she said. I was told later by Shelley Okafor that it was mostly incoherent, something about community standards and proper channels and the spirit of the neighborhood, none of which constituted a quote the station could use without significant editorial context. Meanwhile, Dolores had attempted one final play. Sometime around noon, Craig and 2 other HOA volunteers had moved a folding table, one of the festival tables, across the property line and onto my land, about 3 feet across. I assume this was meant as some kind of territorial statement, or perhaps an attempt to establish some precedent of access. I took a photograph, date stamped. I walked over, introduced myself pleasantly to the volunteers, explained that the table was on my property per the survey, and asked them to move it back. They did so immediately. Craig looked relieved by the clear instruction. I added the photograph to the documentation folder. The sun started dropping around 4:30. The trees went from gold to copper. The creek caught the light in long, flat glints. The band shifted from country covers to classic rock, and then into something slower and warmer, as Ted and Wanda took the floor for their first dance. An open patch of my yard near the creek path that Terrence had strung with Edison bulbs the night before. The whole neighborhood could see it. I watched Dale Pruitt lean on his fence post, watching them dance, and I saw him smile in a way I hadn't seen in a few years. At 8:25, Harlan's crew moved into position. At 8:30 exactly, the first shell went up. I want you to understand what a professionally executed fireworks display sounds like from the inside of it. Not from a blanket on a hill half a mile away, not through a car window, from 75 feet behind the launch mortar, with 200 people around you who've been celebrating for 9 hours and have collectively decided that joy is the appropriate response to existence. The first shell went up with a thump you feel in your sternum, not just hear, feel, and burst 200 feet overhead in a cascading white chrysanthemum that lit the creek, the white oaks, and the entire creek corridor in a flash of cold light. The smoke drifted back down in a sulfur and cedar smoke mix that I will associate for the rest of my life with the specific satisfaction of being completely, documentably, right. The display ran 45 minutes. At 8 minutes in, I walked to the front edge of my property and looked down the street. The HOA festival had ended. They'd packed up around 5, most of the setup already gone. But the neighbors were out. Every house on the block had people on their porches, in their driveways, on the sidewalk. Kids on shoulders, dogs sitting at attention, heads tilted. The rockets went up in 3s and 6s, color bursting against color, the deep concussive whump of each shell rolling down the valley. Dolores Fitch was in her driveway, in the orange blazer, arms crossed, watching the sky above my property the way a person watches a thing they cannot stop and cannot ignore. Shelley Okafor and the Channel 7 camera were still there, getting B-roll of the show. The camera swung between the fireworks and the crowd and, at least twice, found Dolores standing alone at the end of her driveway, while the entire block celebrated 20 yards from her. That footage aired on the local news the following Monday evening. The story Shelley ran was careful and fair. It covered the property rights dispute, quoted from Bo's legal analysis, which he agreed to provide on background, featured a short interview with Rufus explaining the Iron Brotherhood's event and Ted and Wanda's wedding, and noted, with a kind of journalistic understatement that I found more effective than any grandstanding, that the HOA board had declined to comment on the insurance gap and the internal accounting entry that showed a self-paid space rental fee for my property in 2019. The HOA board declined to comment. Let that sit for a second. The following Wednesday, Bo received a call from a property law attorney in Morgantown who said he'd been retained by the Ridgemont Estates HOA board in an advisory capacity. The attorney was professional, measured, and asked whether there was a path to resolution that didn't involve the courts. Bo is also professional and measured, which is why I like him. He said there was, conditionally. We had 3 asks. 1. A formal written apology from the HOA board for unauthorized use of my property in 2019, with a specific acknowledgement that it constituted trespass under West Virginia law. 2. Reimbursement for my lawn restoration costs from the 2019 parking incident, $420, plus 5 years of accrued simple interest. 3. Retraction and expungement of every retaliatory fine that had been levied against me following my initial 2019 complaint, with a refund of the amounts paid. The HOA's attorney came back within a week. They accepted all 3 conditions. The written apology arrived on November 14th, signed by 6 board members. Dolores Fitch's signature was at the bottom of the list, in a cramped, reluctant cursive that I choose to interpret as the handwriting of a person who is, at least in this one moment, experiencing the appropriate consequence of her choices. The check for $562 arrived the same day. The fine expungements were processed by the end of November. Every single one, going back to the first retaliatory $75 charge for the bench by the creek that Dale Pruitt used to sit on. Total amount returned, including interest, $840. I spent some of it on wood. I'm building a new bench, a better one. But here's the mic drop that Bo added, unprompted, as a condition of not pursuing further legal action. The HOA was required to file corrected financial statements with the state and to maintain a proper event liability insurance policy with no coverage gaps going forward, and to notify all homeowners annually of their right to inspect HOA financial records. The notification letter went out in December. It cited West Virginia Code Section 36B-3-118 by name. Most of the neighborhood had never heard of that statute before. They know it now. Thunderclap Ted and Wanda Raines sent me a card in November. Handwritten. It said, "Garrett, you gave us the most beautiful wedding we could have imagined. The fireworks were ours, but the land was yours, and we'll never forget it. I keep it on the refrigerator now, next to where the HOA flyer used to be." The Channel 7 story got picked up by a regional outlet, and then briefly circulated on a few homeowner rights forums online. I got about 40 emails over the following month from people in West Virginia and surrounding states who'd had their own versions of my story. The petty fine, the ignored letter, the growing suspicion that the HOA was operating outside its authority. I answered every one, and in every one I told people the same thing. Read your CC and Rs, request your HOA's financial records, and call a real estate attorney for a free initial consultation. Most of them had never done any of these things. Most of them had options they didn't know about. That, to me, is the part that actually matters. Dolores Fitch stepped down from the HOA board in February. The announcement was sent in a 3-sentence email that described her departure as voluntary and thanked the community for her time served. She has not, as far as I know, purchased any additional gavels. The new board president is a retired civil engineer named Harmon Seagraves, who opened his first meeting by distributing printed copies of the CC and RS and the relevant West Virginia statutes to everyone in the room. The meeting ran 22 minutes. No fines were levied. Dale Pruitt is back on his bench by the creek. I finished it in December. White oak, pegged joints, sealed with tung oil. It's the best thing I've built, technically. Dale brings coffee out there in the mornings. Sometimes I join him. The Iron Brotherhood held their spring charity ride in March, and Rufus called to tell me they'd raised $11,000 for the Appalachian Children's Hospital. He also invited me to join them for the ride, which I did, on a borrowed Honda Goldwing, which is not the most dignified machine in the convoy of Harleys, but served me adequately. Now, here's what we did with my $1,500 rental income from the wedding, because I didn't spend it on lumber alone. I donated $500 to the Harrison County Fairgrounds Youth Scholarship Fund, which helps kids in the county attend 4-H programs and vocational training. I donated $300 to the Clarksburg Public Library in honor of Wanda Raines, the retired librarian who danced with her husband under Edison lights by my creek on a cold October evening. And I put the remaining $700 into a small fund I'm building for a neighborhood creek cleanup day next spring. Something I want to organize myself, with actual neighbors, with nobody's gavel anywhere in sight. I've heard from people watching this that they think I won, and I understand why they'd say that. I got my apology. I got my money back. The person who'd made my life difficult for 3 years resigned. The news camera showed up and told the story. But the honest truth is that I didn't set out to win. I set out to be right, and to be documentably, legally, methodically, undeniably right, so that being right meant something, so that the system, the actual legal system, the statutes and the records and the property surveys, worked the way it's supposed to work, which is to protect the person who's telling the truth. It does work, when you understand it, when you use it. That bench by the creek is still there. The white oaks are still there. The creek is still running. Come spring, the zoysia grass I replanted after the 2019 ruts will finish coming in. Nobody's parking on it.
200 hallets, a light band, fireworks over the creek, and about Casper deflating 40 yards away at a party nobody wanted to attend. That's not poetic justice. That's just what happens when you hand someone a $75 fine for a wooden bench after tearing up their walls and leaving the trash behind. Garrett didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was patient, and because he understood something most people miss. Your CCNR are the contract, a real one, and it cut both ways. The same document Dolores used to fine him for a garden horse was the document that exploded everything she couldn't do. 4 feet of easement, not 62. That gap, 62 feet of assumption, is what buried her. Here's the thing about petty power. It only works when you don't push back. The moment Garrett picked up that notebook and started writing dates, names, and dollars amounts, the balance shifted. Dolores just didn't know it yet. Have you ever paid a fine you knew was wrong just to keep the peace? Drop it in the comments, because I guarantee you are not alone. Share this if someone in your neighborhood needs to hear it. Subscribe for the next one. They had the gavel. He had the deed. There was never a really contest.